Hello. In this talk today, I am having a great honor of being with Anne Baring, who is an author and a scholar. She has her master's degree from Oxford University and her PhD from Ubiquity University in wisdom studies. She was educated in England, France, and the United States. She is a Jungian analyst and the author and co-author of 7 books, including with Jules Cashford, The Myth of the Goddess, Evolution of an Image, with Andrew Harvey, The Mystic Vision and the Divine Feminine, with Dr Scilla Elworthy, Soul Power, An Agenda for a Conscious Humanity. And her latest book, published in 2013 and reprinted in 2020, is The Dream of the Cosmos, A Quest for the Soul. Her book for children, The Birds Who Flew Beyond Time, was based on the Sufi text, The Conference of the Birds, and was illustrated by the late Thetis Blacker. The ground of all her work is a deep interest in history, as well as the spiritual, mythological, shamanic, and artistic traditions of different cultures. Her work is devoted to the recognition that we live in an ensouled world and to the restoration of the lost sense of communion between us and the invisible dimension of the cosmos that is the source and ground of all that we call life. Her websites include a playlist of over 70 talks and interviews on YouTube and the audio recording of her latest book. They are devoted to the affirmation of a new vision of reality and the issues facing us at this crucial time of choice. And I am so happy and honored to have Anne because, well, for many reasons, but her work is, in my sense, extremely resonant with my own work, my own calling, and the purpose of this symposium and the healing that I feel our world is needing. And there's so much richness and wisdom that we could learn from hearing from you today, Anne. But one of the overarching topics that's particularly relevant to the symposium is I love hearing your sense of the historical context of what, in a sense, changed, or what happened with our relationship to the feminine, and then your sense of what you call in this latest book of yours, The Dream of the Cosmos, what happened that we became in a sense dissociated from our souls, and how that contributes to the issues that we're having in our world now. So I would love to have you start wherever you feel called to start with any of that.
Okay, I think that I will start with a dream I had when I was in my 40s, when I was in Jungian analysis at that time. And the dream was that it was nighttime, it was moonlight, and I was in a great sort of field in which there was a dolmen, a huge Neolithic dolmen. And I came round the edge of the dolmen, and in front of me, there was miles upon miles of corn, green corn stretching in front of me in the moonlight. It was brilliantly lit moonlight. And I went across the fields of corn, just skimming the tops of the corn with my feet. I wasn't on the flat ground, but I was on the top of the corn, until I came to a valley, and I realized I couldn't really go further because there was a great net stretched across the valley, and I got caught in it. And it was held by 2 men, two archetypal men, not just ordinary men, but archetypal figures holding the net at each end across this huge valley. And anyway, I was caught in the net, lying on my back, looking up at the sky, which was the night sky. And I saw this enormous image of a cosmic woman stretching from the earth to the heavens. And I was absolutely overwhelmed by what was happening. And I looked up at her. She was naked. She was very beautiful. And I couldn't sort of place her with any goddess that I knew, because I knew quite a lot about the goddesses by then. but I couldn't place her with any particular one. And she didn't speak, but she had a huge labyrinth in her abdomen. And I had the same in my small body, in my abdomen. I had a small labyrinth. And she indicated that my labyrinth was too far to the left and I was to center it as hers was. So that was her message to me. And centering in a Jungian sense would mean becoming more conscious. So her message to me was become more conscious of what I am and what I'm trying to convey to you. So that was really the beginning of the change in my life and the quest, the conscious quest for the divine feminine. And eventually I realized that this was the feminine aspect of God that I was looking at, which was missing in all the traditions, the patriarchal religions. And so I went back in search of that image. And I was working with a friend of mine called Jules Cashford, training to be an analyst at that time. And we decided to write a book on the goddess. And we started off with the Paleolithic. And we found that the goddess was very prominent in the Paleolithic and in the Neolithic, particularly the subsequent era, which was around, but say, between 10,000 and 5,000 BC. But then there was a huge change in what's called the Bronze Age, when bronze weapons were invented. And this was the time when nation states were beginning to be built in places like Sumer and Egypt and the Middle East, when cities were becoming states, so to speak, and they began fighting with each other. And this pattern, which began around, as I say, 4,000 years ago or 2000 BC, has gone on until the present time without stopping, and always weapons getting more powerful, more dangerous, more lethal, until the present time when we've got all these nuclear weapons in the 9 nuclear powers, which nobody is able to get them to dismantle. A lot of people are trying, but they're not really having much success. So this whole process, as I said, it led Jules and I to write this enormous book called The Myth of the Goddess, Evolution of an Image, in which we trace the image of the goddess from the Paleolithic, through the Neolithic, through the Bronze Age, through the Iron Age, and so on, right up to the Virgin Mary of the present time. And we saw how the patriarchal religions got rid of the goddess very effectively by eliminating the feminine aspect of the Godhead, for a start. And then also in the Christian tradition, with the myth of the fall, this was an extremely important myth which has conditioned Christian civilization for 2,000 years, really, or has laid the ground for it. And it gave out a terrible message, which was that we've been exiled to a place which is far from the Garden of Eden. We were banished from a paradisical state to a state which was full of suffering and death and sin, which was all brought into being by Eve taking an apple from that tree of knowledge. Adam got off relatively lightly, but Eve was blamed for introducing the whole fall, if you like, from grace or from the Garden of Eden through taking that apple. And this led to the persecution of women in patriarchal cultures, all 3 of them, that is to say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, for a very long time, really, until the present day, because it's still continuing. If you look at the way the women are treated by the Taliban in Afghanistan, that is the residue of what happened, what began to happen 4,000 years ago. Yeah. And women are treated by the Taliban exactly as they were in Babylonia. All that time ago. They have to wear veils going out, they have to be accompanied by a man, and all that nonsense started all that time ago, and it's still going on. And this is what is so maddening, really, and infuriating about this belief system that women are really the inferior gender, and they must not be educated, and they must be kept under control. And even in our culture, there's a huge amount of misogyny, as we know from the Me Too movement and lots of other things, and the rapes and murders of women that go on constantly. The women are really treated as a sub-gender, not equal with the male gender, and also with suspicion and a certain amount of contempt. So they've had to fight against this for 100 years with the suffragettes, since they got the vote. It's been a very long and arduous and painful process for women. And before that is 3,000 or 4,000 years of suffering, which they just had to put up with because they had no choice. There was nothing they could do. Their voice was completely silenced for 4,000 years. Nobody heard a peep from them. Occasionally we had a queen here and a queen there, but no really people who drew a tremendous amount of respect to them. Those people were missing. Also in the Neolithic and afterwards for a while, they were priestesses in Greece and Rome. They held the role of priestess always and were highly respected. And that was wiped out with the patriarchal religions. There were no more priestesses. So you never heard the voice of woman connected in any way to the divine. So this is what I've been writing about for many years and talking about even as late as a couple of days ago, to show how this whole process has led to the situation that we're in now, where men are still stuck in the old warrior mode and can't get out of it, because always if there's a war, they see, oh, we must have the weapons that that person has got so that we can keep up with these weapons. So the latest thing for the UK is to say we must have the same long-range missile weapon that Russia has. And they'll spend thousands or millions of pounds or dollars developing that weapon because they don't know anything else. That's the only pattern that they know. They think it's going to protect them, but in fact, it doesn't protect them. It makes things increasingly dangerous. The more of these weapons there are, the more likely one of them is likely to go off, or somebody's likely to get hold of it, a terrorist or something, and just let them go off. So this is very upsetting for women, and it's very upsetting to feel so powerless, because we cannot do the change with the same kind of power that men have become addicted to. It has to be a different kind of power. And we have to develop really the power of love and the power of relationship, realizing that it can be as great as the power of destruction and weapons that men are absolutely entrenched in. So it's an extremely difficult situation for both women and men, because men are caught up in it and they perhaps don't want to be caught up. And we've seen in Ukraine that 15,000 young conscripts, or many of them conscripts, were killed in the last 4 weeks, which is a colossal amount of young people to be killed, young men to be killed. And that their parents will be grieving in Russia, unable to do anything to stop this terrible war going on. So until people begin to speak up and say, we will not tolerate our sons going to war in this way, it's not a defensive war against an aggressive enemy, it's an aggressive war against a perfectly innocent people who are being driven out in their millions from their homes, with their homes being destroyed. And this is an absolute disgrace that humanity should still be stuck in this position after 25,000 years of a really quite high civilization and many great achievements and discoveries that have been made by men, almost all by men. And yet, what have we ended up in? What pit of depravity have we ended up in? With Russia has a weapon which can wipe out Ukraine, the whole of Ukraine, or France, which is roughly the same size as Ukraine, with one bomb. I mean, what have we come to that we can invent these things and think it's okay? So at the moment, I'm angry. But at the same time, I don't quite know what to do other than speak to you and a few other people about this, trying to sort of put this in perspective so that people can understand what has happened, how we've got ourselves into this terrible mess, and how we've completely ignored the teachings that have come to us from Christ and from the Buddha and other great teachers, great mystics. We had Father Bede Griffiths warning us a few years ago that if we didn't change, we would have completely had it really as a species. And now we're also faced with climate change. So there are many things that we could have done much earlier if we hadn't been so disconnected from the divine. And if we hadn't had a misconception of what God is, being somewhere quite remote and father figure up there in heaven, instead of being the ground of all being, really, of which we are a part. So we have to completely change our image of God, which I've gone into in one chapter in my book, The Dream of the Cosmos, because we've got it all wrong. And it will take time to put it right. Although if people just realized, if enough people realized overnight how different an image of God they could have, and how different an image of ourselves that we could have as part of God, that could change a lot of things very quickly. So I'll stop there, Martha, and you ask me anything you want or comment.
Yeah, well, I have many things I could ask. One thing I am sitting with, and that I'm hoping to get maybe possibly some answers by hearing people's perspectives in this symposium, is there is, of course, this reemergence of the feminine that you are very versed in and that you talk a lot about. And so there's this, beautiful, powerful, healing version of the feminine that we've lost and that we're remembering, that's coming back into our world. And then also, one thing I really don't know the answer to is there must be a positive healing version of the masculine as well, right? This violent, addicted to killing version of the masculine can't be the vision of the masculine in the eyes of the divine.
No,
to me, it isn't, can't be, right? So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on what?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Because looking back, you see, in all these societies where war was the aim, really, young men had to be warriors. They had no choice unless they were crippled. They were in, what's the word? They had to join whatever army there was at the time because they had no choice. And this has been right up almost to the present day, when conscripts are being put into the war when they're barely trained. And this has gone on for thousands and thousands of years, when men had no choice. And their more sensitive side of their nature, which is just as sensitive as women's, had no chance to live, had no chance to breathe, because they were indoctrinated into this warrior culture, which they couldn't get out of. And also with that dreadful myth of the fall, because Eve was so regarded with such fear and contempt and anger, really, because she'd done all this terrible thing, introducing death and sin into the world, they depreciated the feminine side of their own nature, their feelings, that is to say, and their heart. So when they went into battle, their heart couldn't be allowed to speak to them. They had to fight, they had to die, never having lived through their heart at all. So this is an utter tragic pattern. I remember a dream that somebody told me, which is actually on something to do in my website, with the animus and the fact that a woman had a dream of men lying in water, dead. And this is really about men in the unconscious not being awakened to their own feelings, not being awakened to the possibility of what they could live if they could get away from this warrior syndrome, which has got into the culture nowadays of having to be successful, having to be rich, having to be powerful. It infects business, it infects every aspect. It infects all the exchanges on Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever, with people trying to outdo each other, either in being nasty to each other or in saying how great I am and I've got so many million followers, etc., etc. It's that sort of nonsense which has taken the place of real engagement with the heart for both men and women, because women have copied men's model of putting all the emphasis on the mind science has put far too much emphasis on the mind and on the rational, what they call the rational mind, which isn't really rational at all because it's only half of the mind.
Yes,
That's
right.
another thing. We're stuck in the left hemisphere of the mind, and we've neglected the imaginative, intuitive right hemisphere.
Right.
And for both men and women, they need to go back to square one, like with Grandmother's Footsteps, that game we used to play as children. And, you know, you have to start at the beginning with learning how to connect with your heart for both genders.
Absolutely.
And then we will have a much nicer civilization with men and women not in competition with each other, but in partnership with each other, working together to create a better world.
I think about this a lot in terms of academia. There was a post recently by an old English professor of mine who said that she wants to lead a course essentially looking at literature that is bad, quote unquote. So people then were listing all these books that they consider bad books, and the list included many things that I read as, let's say, a teenager, like spiritually related books. And one thing I realized pretty quickly reading this set of books was that to be a spiritual book almost automatically put it in the category of bad, which upset me for obvious reasons. And one thing that I really appreciate about you and that I resonate with in terms of your background is that you do come from a very robust academic background. I mean, you went to Oxford, you have a PhD. I also was, top-notch student, went to a very well-known school in the United States, etc. And so we both, I think, are grounded in that academic rigor and reality. And yet at the same time, I see you naming something that I feel needs to be named, and I feel like I'm called to name also, which is when we only value that academic, quote unquote, rational brain, we're literally cut off from life. It's so upsetting to me. It's not okay.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, but this has come about. There's a very interesting philosopher and psychiatrist in England called Ian McGilchrist, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, and he wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary, and another huge book he's just written, which I won't mention. But in that book, he showed how the left hemispheric mind has gradually shut down the right hemispheric, which would include all the spiritual side of life and all the opening to the spirit, as it were, and opening to psychic abilities, opening to near-death experiences, which have come in so much in the last 20 years. All that the rational mind categorizes all that as non-rational and therefore non-existent. Mm-hmm. And we have to change all that. And this has been the effect of what's called scientific materialism, mm-hmm. or scientism, which has said that we only live in a material reality. There is no other reality.
Right.
We are the only conscious people in the entire universe. We are not connected to nature or the cosmos. And we're literally sort of biological beings with no free will. We're just mechanical beings going along in a mechanical way in a mechanical universe. And this, to me, is the most dreadful philosophy that could possibly have got a grip on our culture. And it's been going on for 300 years and being taught in our schools for the last 100, definitely. And what can children do when they're taught this? They swallow it hook, line, and sinker, and really they lose touch with their imagination and with their heart, because they have to conform in order to pass exams. And then once they enter the academic world, they don't dare mention anything different, because they'll lose their job. so many scientists can't say a word. Their mouths are zipped shut because they would lose their tenure.
Yeah.
And they would lose their ability to get articles into magazines and, you know, all that sort of thing. So they keep quiet. And this has been terribly powerful for the last, well, anyway, 100 years. Certainly in America, it's very powerful in America, but also in England. And so there are people who've got through the gaps, as it were. Einstein, for instance,
Right.
said wonderful things about the soul and about spirit and about how love should be the whole emphasis, really, of our endeavors. But he has been sort of ignored, really. He did his marvelous theory of relativity, but nobody listened to what he was saying. And apart from that, and we've had other great, I mean, look at the Dalai Lama, that teaching is entirely about reconnecting with the heart. But science wouldn't connect with the Dalai Lama because they wouldn't acknowledge that his thought was of any value. So you have a split, absolute, right the way down the middle between the academic mind, or the rational mind, and the non-rational, imaginative and intuitive mind, which is in touch with other dimensions of reality and could teach us an awful lot in a very short time if we opened our minds to it. But I do think with quantum physics, this is what I was talking about a couple of days ago, that with quantum physics, we're given an absolutely marvelous breakthrough into a different kind of science, getting right away from this scientism, which is showing that the entire universe is connected at the subatomic level. Everything is connected to everything else. So we are not disconnected from nature. We are not disconnected from the cosmos, and we are not disconnected from each other. So I think I put great hope in that, particularly the work of Nassim Haramein and Jude Caravan, those two cosmologists, whose work is getting very well known on YouTube, and certainly Jude Caravan through her books. So I would draw the attention of your audience to those two people and to look at their YouTube videos and see what they're saying, because they're saying something utterly different from what academic science is saying, and utterly different from what religions have been saying, because they're showing how God is not separate. They don't mention the word God, but you can get the inference there that everything really is divine, everything is connected, and everything is love, basically grounded in love. Even that coming through, both of those scientists is coming through. And the connections are with these things called Planck units, which is a basic unit of matter. And it takes trillions of these Planck units to make a proton, or to be part of a proton. And then the proton is part of the atom, and the atom part of the cells that are in our body. So it's absolutely fascinating that the revelation, I call it a revelation, that is coming through now through quantum physics, and also through men like Neil Donald Walsh, who, thank God, is in touch with his imagination and has written many books about what God talked to him about and said to him. And he's extremely wise. So there are people around who we can listen to, definitely. I mentioned him, but there's also Deepak Chopra has been talking for years about this, how we can change our whole image of reality if we listen to people like him and other people. So there's a lot out there to nourish and feed us, but it simply doesn't enter into the mainstream. It doesn't enter into government thinking, government planning, but it's like a sort of parallel universe or parallel construct of reality.
Well, so I was a therapist for a long time, a clinical social worker, and I worked a lot primarily with trauma and child abuse. And one of the big tenets of trauma work is that, you know, when you're in a trauma state, you tend to be in your fight or flight mode. So you tend to be in your hindbrain mostly, and your frontal lobe and this part of your brain shuts off just to survive, right? So a lot of the time, therapists who are working with trauma will help people come back into their whole brain. So they're able to use their executive functioning and all that. And so I know that on a neurobiological level, but when I started in my praying, I started getting taken up into the cosmos and into literally all of infinity and all these things. And one of the messages I kept getting, that it seems like the spirit world is adamant that we need, is that it's not just about us going from our hindbrain to our whole brain. It's about us going from our hindbrain to our whole brain, to our whole body, to our whole being, to ourselves, literally as infinity. And that when we know that when we go from our hindbrain to our whole brain, our ability to think and come up with new solutions gets infinitely higher. But imagine if we don't just use our whole brain, we use our whole being, which is actually infinity, and the whole ourselves as everything. Imagine what comes through in that state of being. And Einstein is one example of somebody I think of who I think was doing that. I mean, I don't know a lot about you. I think you probably know a lot more about Einstein than I do, but one thing I think was true about him is that he would ride on his bicycle, in circles, and he would do a lot of his thought experiments just as he was riding his bicycle. And that's where a lot of his knowing about existence would come through, just by him, I'm assuming, kind of going into this collective unconscious, or whatever you would want to call it, where he wasn't just using his brain. I don't think.
No, he was using his imagination. Because he saw himself traveling on a sunbeam to the edges of the universe or something like that. And that from there, he got the understanding of his whole theory of relativity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact story, and I may not have got it quite right, but that was the thing that started him off. He saw it really like in a vision.
Yeah.
And then he brought the vision back. And because he had the mathematical ability to put it into mathematics, he was able to translate that vision into mathematical numbers or equations. So definitely, I think they're quite right, your higher beings telling you that, but also that we have to move from our mind to our heart. And this is something we've completely lost the ability to live through the heart. Yeah. And this is something the indigenous people know and could teach us, because they've never lost it. In all these 25,000 years, they've never lost it. And they've also always known how to connect with altered states of consciousness, with sacred plants, in shamanic ways, and they've never lost that. And we could learn a lot through using psychedelic drugs in that way, in fact, in a controlled situation, to open our consciousness to far wider dimensions of the universe, or of the inner universe, not the outer one. So there's a great deal that's around now, but is not kind of formalized in a way of teaching great numbers of people. But it could come, I think. And your experience and my experience are like the sort of opening the door to this different kind of consciousness. There's also the Heart Math Institute, which I should mention, which has been teaching people how to connect with their heart for many years now. And that's in my book as well. I've actually used the description of what they suggest as a method of connecting with the heart.
Mm-hmm. Oh, another thing you might know more about than I do, but you brought up the Dalai Lama, and I watched a documentary of him in dialogue with Western quantum physicists.
Yes.
And what was fascinating to me was these quantum physicists who he was speaking with are, Nobel Prize winning, the top of the top of the top people from wherever, the United States, Britain, probably other Western countries too. And so they are the top in their field. But what I noticed was that the Dalai Lama, of course, completely agreed with their theories. And yet he was pointing out that the monks, and I'm assuming nuns also in ancient Tibet, probably ancient India, already knew all this stuff.
They did, yes,
The exact
absolutely.
same things. Yeah.
They've known it with them in India. The Upanishads are all about this.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yes.
So
So
we've got an awful lot of catching up to do.
I know. And what are we doing? And you know, I mentioned to you, I grew up largely in South Asia. And I lived in Pakistan and Bangladesh as a child, but my family has been in India for 100 years. So I don't know. I grew up in a colonialized society where I happened to be a white person coming from the privileged, highly privileged class. And so I know this firsthand, and it's not a good thing, which is that we, as the white colonialist people, tend to look at, let's say, the ancient Tibetans and assume that our education system and our knowledge is superior to theirs. And
Yeah.
it's not. It's
Well,
just
that's
not.
right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I think I learned that in India because I went with my university degree and everything to India when I was 25. And I saw the wisdom that was there in the soul of the people, the way they lived, the way they spoke, the way they related to each other, the way they created beautiful saris or patterns on the ground. It was quite a different revelation to me of a different kind of knowing.
Yeah.
And that's what we've lost. And we've been so arrogant with our superiority and our religious superiority, which has been so much dust, really, compared to those ancient religions, which knew far, far more than we know now.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. So yeah, I mean, is there, in your Dream of the Cosmos book, you do mention some practical suggestions you have for the world. Is there anything specific you would want to speak to right now with regard to what should we do?
Well, I think one of the first and most important thing is, how do we recover the sense of the sacred that we've lost? How do we realize that the earth is a sacred part of a sacred cosmos?
Yes.
And that we ourselves are sacred beings, and every other form of life on the planet is a sacred being or part of a sacred being. That is a primary thing we need to learn, or we need to relearn, because we had it once upon a time. We had it in the Neolithic, definitely. We had that sense of the sacredness of everything around us. And also we had the means of connecting with the cosmos through shamanic methods in that time. We used sacred plants as a way of listening to the voice of the soul, if you like, or the voice of the cosmos, and getting our laws and our ways of behaving in that very early time from the instruction that we were given from these inner realms. And we've lost that, and we could get it back. I mean, there are many people who do channeling nowadays, and even astrology is a form of channeling in a way, because it's using the structure of the universe to interpret the message coming from the universe. And Heather is wonderful at doing that. And she sees this as a time of tremendous awakening and change. And I would agree with her that this is the time, and it's the time that was predicted by Jesus, you know, the time of judgment. We're in it now. And if we don't change, we've had it as a species. And I don't think we would destroy the whole planet, but we could destroy a great part of it, including a great part of our own lives, if we don't take the trouble to find out a different way of living and realize that we can't go on paying attention to governments who've completely lost the plot.
Yeah.
So I think I would leave it at that, but it's been lovely talking to you.
You
and
too.
having an opportunity to share my thoughts and share my concern, share my distress and sorrow that we are so still undeveloped as to want to kill each other and destroy the wonderful life that we are.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for the work you have done and are doing in the world. I truly, deeply appreciate it.
Thank you.